Hi, this is Bits and Pieces, the official podcast of Component Supply. I'm Kristin.
And I'm Mark.
And today we're going to talk to you about needles, which we did a little survey. We walked around the Component Supply shop today in the offices, and we asked different people, what do you think of when you think of needle? And there are a lot of different responses, so we'll show that to you here before we get started. First thing that comes to mind when you hear needle.
Hub.
Okay, first thing that comes to mind when you hear needle.
Sharp.
To mind when you hear needle.
Ouch.
First thing that comes to mind when you hear needle.
Blunt.
First thing that comes to mind when you hear needle.
Hypodermic. Any 250. So.
First thing that comes to mind when you hear needle.
And then just put the reminder out.
First thing that comes to mind when you hear needle.
Ouch.
First thing that comes to mind when you hear needle.
Blood.
First thing that comes to mind when you hear needle.
Happy.
First thing that comes to mind when you hear needle.
Sharp.
First thing that comes to mind when you hear needle.
Needle, medical, diabetics. First thing that comes to mind is ouch.
First thing that comes to mind when you hear needle.
Blood.
First thing that comes to mind when you hear needle. Perfect. First thing that comes to mind when you hear needle. First thing that comes to mind when you hear needle.
Insulin and diabetes.
Comes to mind when you hear needle.
The needle sign?
Okay. Yeah. First thing that comes to mind when you hear needle. Well. Comes to mind when you hear needle.
Short.
So you can tell that when you hear needles, a lot of different things come to mind. And it's because there are several different applications for needles that are used every day. We can pretty much put them in three buckets, at least three buckets that we see, and one of them that we don't really want to see. So we're going to start, by just kind of high level telling you about these applications. We're going to talk a little bit about, decisions that need to be made based on that clinical need. And then we'll move into just some tips for picking your needles and some challenges that we've seen. Just a casual conversation, but if you're working in this space with needles, hopefully this podcast will be informative for you. So we've got three buckets. The first would be simple dispensing. These are your blunt tip cannulas that are used in really kind of simple, almost like, yes, med tech, but almost kind of on the industrial side of med tech space. And then you have anything that's going to have device penetration. So it's beyond just dispensing. There's a need for pressure. You have to open something up, okay? And then you have the tissue penetration part, which is the part that the Component Supply team gets a little squirmy about when you're asking about needles. They're like, ugh, ouch, or ooh, shots, or things like that, That's what comes to mind for them. So they all may be called needles, but you can see they are solving fundamentally different clinical or engineering needs. Mm-hmm. What did you say? I forget.
I think I just said ouch.
Ouch. Yeah.
There's another, I clarify one more thing. And this threw me off because we've gotten requests for a needle and it'll be a wire.
Mm-hmm.
But there is the sewing aspect of a needle.
Yep.
And when you go out and look at needles just in the general web search, that comes up. And there are applications in the medical device industry for like a sewing type needle. Mm-hmm. So to clarify, we're on the tubing side of this needle world, not the wire side, if you will.
That's right. Yeah, that's a good clarification because there is that distinction for sure. So just to start from like a standard dispensing needle kind of application, this is probably what allows for the broadest gauge range availability off the shelf. There's a lot of universal Luer compatibility. Usually these are made with polypropylene hubs. So the cost stays pretty low, very rapidly available. You typically don't have a hard time finding dispensing needles in the world. There are a lot of options for that. These are what would be used we see them in a lot of other industries. These we see often used, perhaps you're using them to accurately dispense your adhesive. Mm-hmm. You're applying some sort of UV cure resin, or you might be transferring fluids in a diagnostic build where dispensing perhaps is not incredibly precise. You have to. There's some flexibility. There's a high tolerance.
But we get custom requests for just dispensing.
That's right.
I mean, you've seen
yeah.
that, right?
Yeah, it's a dispensing application. I'm trying to think of in medical where it's used the most. I think what we were saying before is just the more adhesive kind of like assembly aid, manufacturing aid, dispensing applications where we see those more standard use. And it's interesting, just to sidebar with standard, a lot of times you might think, if I order the standard needle, it's going to look the same no matter who we buy it from. But the hub colors bring into question standard, right?
Yes. That's cruel.
Do you know much about why even a one gauge size from one company might have one color and the same gauge size for another might have another? Because there's some history there we don't know about.
There's actually an ASTM on that, but it's not. It's fixed to kind of a particular industry. It's not broad.
Would it only be the tissue penetration kind?
So it actually doesn't even have anything to do with that. It's more to do with like manufacturing. It doesn't even have anything to do with the medical side. It hasn't been, that has not been defined or defined well. And they did it for the reason so you knew like, oh, a green needle is this gauge and an orange needle is this gauge. But if you go from one industry to another, that's actually not an accurate. You're not going to be able to jump from, say, the medical device industry or healthcare. Let's just say that healthcare industry to say the electronics industry where they're assembling, things using, precise placement of adhesives or anything like that. You're not going to be able to tie those together.
So there's a little bit of a gray area there. So speccing gauge size rather than color becomes important. We do have people that just say, I need the green ones. We've had that before. Yeah. Less and less common, I think. Yeah, but, calling out your specific gauge size, I think, is very important.
But in the spec process, when you're designing it, if you can, don't specify a color. Now, sometimes that's important because you don't want somebody to grab the wrong needle depending on it. But if you can ever get away with it, don't say, oh, I need a green 22 gauge, hub for a couple of reasons. One, manufacturing, but also be very careful because there's like green and olive in the same size. So green is not green. So just if you can ever get away from specifying the color, just don't eliminate that altogether if you can.
Right. At Component Supply, we try to be as consistent as possible. We've put together a guide that we'll put in the description of this podcast so that you can see when you buy from Component Supply and you buy one of our off-the-shelf needles, it'll come with this certain gauge, will always come with this hub. And again, if there ever were like a large-scale industry shift in that, we would make sure everyone knows. But that's kind of the blunt needle. The hub here is polypropylene rather than a stainless material. Usually the focus here with dispensing is it's a disposable component. Polypropylene keeps your costs very low. So that's a great thing for that application where tolerance maybe is not quite as tight. Now, to be fair, I have on the custom side of the polypropylene hub configuration needle, we do see tighter specs in the manufacturing process that they might call out where they want the glue line to be. They might call out, even though it's just a dispensing application, like you said before, there are critical specs in that.
Oh, yes.
But there might also not be, versus in some of these other applications, the spec is pretty much always critical on angles, or they call out that hub particularly. So then we move, a little bit more specific. We move into the device penetration phase. So we're out of just straight dispensing, and you're adding an additional clinical need, really, or engineering requirement, which is it has to penetrate something. So in this situation, it's going to require more sharpness. So that straight cut, even the straight cut that has, it's deburred, or it maybe has a little, not a chamfer, but just an aggressive deburr rather. You'll need more sharpness. You'll actually need to call out a bevel geometry because it's going to penetrate something. And that geometry will have an anti-coring property typically, because you don't want the material that's being penetrated to move into the needle and affect your application, your device. You're going to be thinking about structural integrity here, because typically there's a pressure application. There's an additional pressure that you need, obviously, to penetrate something. And so you're going to be a little bit more careful with your specs. How thin of a wall are you going to have on your needle, for example? Can that thin wall absorb the pressure that's needed to penetrate a septum? And then you're having to consider repeatability here. Oftentimes, these people are trying to get more than one use out of them, so they want to make sure that they can be used multiple times. So the coring piece, the anti-coring needle, the geometry differs depending on the application, depending on the septum material, but the goal here is that those plugs do not enter the system, right? Because that becomes a critical failure. So there are some specialized anti-coring tip grinds that prevent that from happening.
You've seen applications where the septum material changed, and therefore it doesn't penetrate as well, or it might penetrate, but it's now at you've got a situation where as they force it into, that force causes it to bend. But so now we've got, because we use this wall thickness, that changed in this. It had nothing to do with the needle.
Right.
The septum changed.
The environment changed.
Right.
And I think that's a really important point, that anytime an environment changes, it changes the output of the component that you're using with. And sometimes it takes us a while to get an engineer or product developer to kind of think in that minutia of this one component. It takes a long time. For us, we're studying the tip, we're studying this, and we've gotten better at this, I think, of asking questions, what has changed in your process? And when we can determine it was a material change, then we can get it back a little bit into a prototype to make sure that we're adjusting our processes, the capability. Maybe we're looking at that drawing again and getting something different spec'd in based on the material change. But that's really important, again, when you're dealing with a needle, and we talk about this on every podcast, I feel like having the conversation with the manufacturer, the supplier, anytime there's a change, it's important. Or even if you have a change to your component, if you can give a why to your supplier, that can help them tuck away and maybe even advise on that design change in a way that's beneficial based on what they've seen in their processes. Sometimes we'll see repeated access of a vial. So, you're trying to almost have a suction application where you're trying to get something out of that vial. And that becomes important for a couple of reasons. It's not just the tip that's penetrating, it's the angle of the tip that allows the most of presumably a more expensive liquid to be extracted without waste. So that's one that comes up pretty frequently. And again, you change the vial. Maybe you're moving to a bigger size or something. Those are all considerations that we have to have when we're designing these device penetration kinds of needles. Okay, so you have the dispensing needle, that's very basic, very accessible, very disposable. You move into device penetration, that's raising the stakes a little bit, right? Human tissue penetration raises the stakes even more. These become your hypodermic needles. These are your biopsy needles, your surgical cannulas, your catheter introducers. Those are the tissue penetrating kind of devices. And we talk about, clinical need driving these component selections. This is where you're dealing with, because you're dealing with penetration of human tissue, immediately patient comfort comes to mind. Immediately minimizing trauma comes to mind, right? And so there are a few ways that we handle those kinds of considerations, right? Whether it's the lubricity of the device, maybe we need to consider a surface finish. Maybe we need to consider a coating. Maybe we need to consider a wall thickness, right? Everyone wants the thinner wall, but it has to have structural reliability as well. So the coatings and the surface finish, things like that, are going to affect how the needle moves through a tissue, how much discomfort the patient is experiencing. So you have to think about that. And then anytime, right, you're entering the human body, your material traceability, your regulatory compliance skyrockets. And again, we don't always get to know.
What it's used for?
What it's used for. And so there's no way that we can read everybody's minds. And same with any manufacturer, right? The more that you can share about the application up front in the R&D prototype phase, the better it is. We don't want to be advising you on something wrong just because we didn't know it was clinical use. You sent a drawing, we're like, here we go. But later down the road, you might need these additional requirements. So we try to get that from you, but you know your device better than we do. So anytime that you can advise on application or reveal a little bit of the application, that will help us know kind of how to help you get what you need. We've seen it before. We've seen it before where someone, they got all the way to this clinical trial and didn't have biocompatibility testing because they were using an off-the-shelf part. It doesn't come with that documentation. Right. And so it had to, how many thousands of dollars?
It was a lot of thousands of dollars.
It was a lot of thousands. And it was sad for us. We didn't know. They didn't reveal. Right. They had been buying product from us for years. So we try and be mindful of that and ask when we can and try to understand the process as well. But equally, you have to be willing to share it with us so that we can help in that situation. So when we get a design, trying to think, we get a drawing and it doesn't have an application. We don't have a conversation with it. It's just an email. I'm trying to think of in our training how we prepare our sales team or customer service team to anticipate what this might be used for. If it doesn't, sometimes it's just like biopsy needle and we can deal with that. But sometimes it doesn't, it's just the print.
This is one of those that, our sales team asks as many questions as they can, but then you're at the mercy of whatever they either can or are willing to share. We don't typically like to just walk out of the shop and blindly make things. We kind of like to know what it's being used for, and not so much if it's a locked product. It's done. There's nothing to change. We're going to set up and make it, but particularly in the beginning when it's in revision, because we can't add value. Yeah. And at the same time, if we don't want to just make it based off of someone's kind of thoughts, send it to them and it fail. If we can learn a little bit ahead of time, it gives us a chance to say we've made this mistake before. Yeah, exactly. And because we don't want to send product, even if it's made exactly like the print, right? Mm-hmm. We don't want to send product just to go fail, especially if we've done it before in the past and can say, "Hey, look, we've done this before. We recognize this is you're asking it to do something that it probably won't do. We need to change a wall thickness. We need to consider a different tip geometry. Mm-hmm. We can't make it that long or shouldn't make it this long, whatever that is." Yeah. And so, from a training standpoint, our sales group, they know this, and if they don't know it, they know when to get someone involved. Mm-hmm. But it is relying on the initial information to begin with. Right. If it's just this is all you get, go make it. We'll do it. But sometimes our goal is not to just send you send you the best product we can that what you're asking. Our goal is to send you and help you build the right thing. Exactly. Yeah. We want to help you build the right thing. And so often we kind of use these buckets to help us make determinations, but there are other buckets aside from just the clinical need, right? So is it a single use application or is it a use that's going to require lots of repeatability, right? So that might differentiate. Are you going to use a polypropylene hub versus do you need a stainless hub? Same with sterilization. Depending on your sterilization process, that might help us determine how to help you there. Whether or not there's an access point, that'll help us with tip geometry. You go from a blunt to a bevel to some kind of multifaceted end, to an anti-coring grind. So we can't know that unless you tell us. And some people, I think, don't realize that those angles make a huge difference. They make a difference. I think, you've experienced this. There's nothing, the minute you go from just a straight cut, there's no such thing as standard. There's not a standard bevel. There's not a standard lancet. So putting something out there that's like I want an 18 gauge needle, just put a standard bevel on it. Yep. Straight cut is a standard. the minute you deviate from that, there's no such thing as standard. So if you're not sure and you're looking for standard, we need a conversation. Because my standard may not be your standard, and either both of those may not work for what they're trying to
Right.
accomplish.
I have no grind standard in case like bevel standard. Like what? No, that's not a thing. But I will say another piece of that puzzle. It's not just the tip. I don't know that we've gone into this much, but if you have an access point that's difficult to get to because not a straight needle can't always reach where it needs to go, right? So that's where you have these different bend configurations, right, that can be required, whether it's an anatomical access point or some kind of a strict restriction on your assembly environment, or specialized surgical angle. All of those can impact whether or not you go from a straight needle to something that has a bend in it, right? So it's not just about fluid dispensing. It's not even about penetrating tissue or penetrating a device. It becomes about access points, reach. Yeah. So again, when we know more about the application, we can advise whether or not that's appropriate and what angles work. And this is where we also have to have those hard conversations about how far can you bend it without compromising the wall. Right?
Well, that was, we've had several, probably the most fun was an application where you're trying to figure out if I'm trying, if you're listening to this, it's hard to see, but if you're holding, you're kind of trying to hold yourself still and dispense something, what's the best way to do that? And one of the ones that we came up with, the best way to do is to put your hands together, which means that the needle itself had to turn 180 degrees and come back right to your hand because you were holding them both together. And so understanding what you're trying to accomplish and then how you're trying to accomplish it can change those angles and how we're going to, the best way to accomplish reach as much as, the tip geometry.
Right. And as you're determining these things, you might be testing different characteristics or different specs at different times. So, we talk about not everything can be custom or even should be custom, but probably something at some point will be in a lot of these applications, specifically the bucket number 2 and bucket number 3. They're going to move into a custom space usually. And it's a hard trade-off because we want you to test early. We want to give you access to components, but we also have this realistic expectation that's going to move to custom. So how are you balancing those two things? And I think it's important to say, well, right now we're testing the tips. And you can test a tip without having it fully incorporated into a hub. It's actually cheaper. Once you put a stainless hub on that, your price goes up. Honestly, even once you put a polypropylene hub on it, your price is probably going to go up. And so if step 1 is to test your bevel, then you have that option just with a hypodermic tube, right? And if you need to test the length and the bevel, then that's another part. And then if you're needing to compare a few different ones, that's part of it. But you do get to a point where or even thinking forward, we don't need to test this yet. Eventually this thing's going to have a bend on it. We're just testing the tip right now. Eventually it's going to have a bend on it. Keeping that conversation early on, there's always a trade-off between wanting to have things fast and wanting to have things exactly right. So it depends on what you're trying to test. Anytime you're going to start testing pressure, you've got to have the hub, or there's no point in testing. So those are things to just kind of make note of early.
So on these, when you talk about wanting to, knowing that eventually your application requires a metal hub, but early on you really don't. You're trying to test other things, not the metal hub aspect. One option is to have it made with the polypropylene hub, and then have us weld a stop where the metal hub would be. So the distance, because this is important. These are not the same size.
Right.
And so you can test kind of all the features without incorporating in the process without incorporating the cost of an expensive metal hub, and not have to change any design. You can still get, okay, my length is going to be this, so I know where my stop is. And so there are some options there from the test, because you don't really want to incorporate the cost in the beginning with those hubs. Right. Because what if it's wrong? What if you need to make some adjustment? So there are inexpensive ways, or less expensive ways, significantly less expensive ways to test those without having to incorporate a hub or having to redesign some length afterwards.
Right. I think for this, it kind of leads us into common obstacles or common mistakes that we see early on with some of these needle designs. So one is treating all needles the same. A blunt dispensing needle is very different from a biopsy needle. They're different instruments. Designing around gauge size alone can be, diameter is simply one variable. There are lots of variables to a needle and how it incorporates into your device. Ignoring the potential for sterilization and how these materials, we're not worried as much about the stainless, right, but how the polypropylene is going to respond in different sterilization cycles. If it's exposed to any chemicals, for example, that's another one. Or delaying customization or doing too much customization at once. Sometimes we see over-engineering for these processes. Oh, that's all you're doing with that, and you have this complicated thing. But vice versa, maybe we delayed it too long. You're not getting the result you need because you didn't move into that custom space earlier. So, but mostly you have to design around intent. What is it actually going to do? What is the intent of the needle? What is its purpose? What is it going to do? What constraints there are involved? And how do we move forward knowing what all of those processes are? So we're going to probably preach it till we die, that earlier the conversation, the better. The more you supply or provide to your supplier, the better. So a lot of times, you can start early with the simple dispensing needle. If that's your application, you're needing to validate fit, form, function, flow. Those are the performance thresholds that you can, be considering. But then you also, at some point, you'll have to move into pressure because you're going to move into access or, different things. So, but there's a way to start inexpensively and to grow. We have grown, our needle manufacturing business has grown significantly over the years, our capacity, and we enjoy doing those for lots of different applications. We have a really skilled group of people making these needles. And so it's exciting. It's not scary when they see something complex, but we do like being with it from the beginning so we can advise early and not get the print when it's already kind of a locked drawing and have to be the ones to tell them, oh, you could have saved a lot of money or a lot of time here.
You look at that as we view this as there's a finite number of dollars to research and development, right? If we can save a little bit in this one project, that means it can be used in another project.
That's right.
And the more that's out there, the better.
Yeah, that's it. So that's kind of the overview of the needles for now. I know, again, we keep it high level because we're dealing with so many industries and applications. So if you have any specific questions about your needles or your drawings or projects that you're involved in, we'd be happy to try and answer those questions for you. We'll put some resources in the podcast description. And until then, let's go change the world.